And now I would like to introduce our first speaker of the morning. It's Greg Aplet from the Wilderness Society. Greg is the Senior Director of Ecology at the Wilderness Society in their Denver office, where he supervises ecological research within the organization. And more importantly than that, Greg is a good friend. I went to college while Greg was getting his PhD at CSU and actually worked for Greg and read tree ring cores and lodgepole pines that were 250 years old and about this big diameter, and that's why I'm still cross-eyed. We really appreciate Greg coming over, and please give a warm welcome to Greg Aplet.
All right, well, I'm one of those people who was asked to step in and fill those empty shoes, so I'm reminded of the summer my kids convinced me and my wife to travel to Tennessee with them to Bonnaroo, this gigantic outdoor concert, which was quite the experience. But the reason I'm reminded of it is that about 3 days before the concert, one of the headliners, Mumford & Sons, had to withdraw from the concert. One of their members got sick, and the organizers had to scramble to fill those shoes, and came up with, on a moment's notice, with Jack Johnson, to the great relief of the crowd. But and he did great. He performed really well on Saturday night, but he was also keenly aware of the situation he was in and the shoes that he had to fill, and acknowledged that there was no way that he would have been on the main stage at Bonnaroo were it not for the unfortunate circumstances of Mumford & Sons. And so I think I'm kind of feeling in the same way. I'm highly unqualified here to be a keynote speaker before you today, but were it not for the unfortunate circumstances of our federal brethren, I'll try to do justice, though I guarantee you I'm no Jack Johnson. So the first thing that I would like to do is, just because I understand that the theme here is resilience, and that there has been quite a bit of discussion within the college and outside about the meaning of resilience, just sort of throw out there to start with what I mean when I use resilience in a title like this, and it's actually already in the title here. When I I think I'm supposed to turn this on. Sorry. Does this help, or does this hurt? Okay. Sorry. So when I use the term resilience, I really am talking about reducing the risk of loss in the long run of the things that we care about. And so for me, there are a whole host of potential definitions of resilience, but when I think about resilience, I think about trying to make sure that we have in the future what we need from our systems. And so as you'll see from my talk today, what I'm most concerned about is that the risk of losing those things that we care about. So that's kind of my general definition, if that makes any sense at all. Let's see. Oh, here we go. Forward, backwards. Perfect. Thank you. All right. And this idea really stems from this strong feeling that I have that climate change really is a game changer for natural resources management. For 100+ years, we've had the luxury of assuming that our ecological systems would continue to produce for us, regardless of what it was we wanted from those systems, whether it was wood or forage or aesthetics. We could assume that if we let it go, it would continue to produce. And it was our job as natural resource managers to tweak those systems to increase the things that we wanted, whether it's, silviculture and timber production or forage production or wilderness management. It was our job to make changes around the margins to improve the productivity of systems that we assumed would continue to produce for us. But under climate change, I don't believe that's any longer the case. We can no longer assume that they will produce. And it's really changed the nature of natural resource management from a production paradigm to a risk management paradigm. And so I think that when we're talking about managing for resilience, we're talking about managing to reduce the risk to systems from climate change. So I'm going to talk today about managing climate risk. I'm going to talk a little bit about what it is we're afraid of losing, a little bit about sort of a conceptual framework for thinking about change in ecosystems that's been a part of my thinking for several years now, and then talk about how that framework can be applied to managing climate risk in our ecosystems. So what is it that we're concerned when we talk about the risk, climate risk, or the probability of loss from climate change? What is it we're worried about? Clearly, biodiversity is a big concern. We're afraid of losing the habitats for the species and elements of biodiversity that are in our system. Other people are less concerned about the actual players. They're concerned about sort of these higher level processes of ecosystem services that matter more to humans. And other people are simply concerned that we're going to lose the fruits of 100 years of conservation in this country as climate moves out from under all of the places that we have protected in order to try to conserve elements of those systems. I think all of those are legitimate concerns and really roll up into a broad category of concerns that can just be broadly called the benefits of wildland ecosystems. And I draw a distinction here using the word wildlands, that there are certain systems that we consider wildlands and certain systems that we don't, that we recognize as non-wildlands. It's the concern and domain of natural resource management to worry about wildland ecosystems. And so where my talk starts and stops is sort of at this boundary of wildland ecosystems. Well, what do we mean by that? If we're trying to preserve the benefits of wildland ecosystems, how do we recognize what it is we're concerned about? Well, this project started with an effort at the Wilderness Society 15, almost 20 years ago now. Strategic planning exercise internally. We were kind of at a crisis point in our history. Wilderness didn't seem to be too popular in the Congress as it is today, as it remains today. And we struggled to identify what it is we really cared about. We realized that even if all the places that could be wilderness, could be designated wilderness were designated, there would still be places that we cared about and that we wanted to see sustained into the future. And so we started talking about defining ourselves less in terms of National Wilderness Preservation System wilderness and in terms of sustaining a network of wildlands into the future. And I was asked to kind of probe what that meant for the organization. I did a lot of reading of kind of fundamental, foundational literature in wildness and wildlands and wilderness, and came up with a couple of fundamental qualities that that confer wildness to a place and make it a wild land. And I didn't go straight to the definition of wilderness in the Wilderness Act, but I use it here because it's iconic and familiar and actually captures well these two qualities that I'm talking about. The first is a series of phrases used in the definition of wilderness in red here. Earth and its community of life, primeval character, natural conditions. These are all things that are associated with wilderness, or with wildness. But then there's also this other set of phrases in yellow: untrammeled, primeval influence, affected primarily by the forces of nature. Over and over and over again in the literature, these two notions emerge where what makes a place wild is defined both by these qualities that can be boiled down into some description of ecological condition, or the wholeness of ecosystems, or ecosystem integrity, or in more modern parlance, the historical range of variability, some measure of sort of the intactness of ecosystems that we inherited from the past and that we wish to pass forward into the future. But also is this notion that not only do those systems have all of the parts and functions of the past, but they're also functioning without a great deal of human intervention. And so there had been some discussion in the wilderness literature about both of these qualities being essential to wilderness, often placing them at polar ends of a spectrum and talking about the tension of wilderness management that is required to sustain both of them at the same time when they were considered to be in opposition. But my reading of the literature convinced me that they were not opposite to each other, not in tension, but were in fact orthogonal, unrelated to each other. And if you place them as two axes, create a two-dimensional space defined by these two axes, you can essentially place all land within this space created by these two axes. And I illustrate that by talking about the two axes from novel to pristine. Pristine is probably not the best word. It's the word I used in writing this up many years ago. But as I say, pristine, probably think of more in terms of whole or within the historical range of variability, as opposed to novel and very different from historical conditions. The freedom from control runs from a highly controlled environment to the self-willed or untrammeled environment. And as I say, any land can be placed in this space with, down the built environment of the city in the lower corner as a highly novel, altered, and highly controlled system, as opposed to the Arctic refuge as the opposite type of landscape, one that has all of its parts still functioning largely as they did in the past, all its species, large-scale functions like wildlife movement, still intact, without any really direct human control in the system. And the idea was that wildness increases along both axes, out from the lower left to the upper right. And somewhere along that axis, depending on context, depending on where you are, there's some division between non-wild land and wild land. Well, you'll notice that if that is in fact a spectrum, then the opposite corners, the upper left and the lower right, are also somewhere along that spectrum, perhaps equally wild, but for different reasons. And I draw your attention to the upper left-hand corner, illustrated by the C&O Canal, which is, this is an example of a novel but self-willed ecosystem. The C&O Canal is just outside of Washington, D.C., for those of you who are not familiar with it. It's a historical artifact, a ditch built alongside the Potomac River for the purpose of facilitating commerce between Washington, D.C. and points inland, built in the 18th century, maybe early 19th century. It's an artificial structure. It's now covered with invasive species. The species composition's been highly altered, but it's a place that the Park Service manages as a wildland. They largely keep their hands off. They don't try to cultivate it, And the people of the city of Washington, D.C. adore this place as a wildland, despite the fact that it's a highly altered environment. Over here in the lower right-hand corner, I illustrate with the Curtis Prairie, a restored prairie ecosystem on the University of Wisconsin campus in the University of Wisconsin Arboretum. A restored prairie where all the species are representative of the tall grass prairie, all the functions of seed dispersal and application of fire and mimicking of grazing are provided by humans. So it's highly historically accurate, but a highly controlled environment. So no matter where, think of a system and you can place it somewhere in this range of conditions. Well, and as I say, somewhere along there is a spectrum that transitions to what we recognize as wildland. Well, if you believe that construction of the world, then we can start thinking about management in terms of the directions of management within that space, and think about the sort of classic case that's characterized most of human history of transformation, of bringing a landscape into tighter control for the purpose of changing it from a natural to a less natural condition. So on the opposite end of the spectrum, we can think of a place as management, as a management action of recovery, letting a place go and letting it return or restore itself. That's also might be thought of as passive restoration, letting a place go and having it return to some historical condition. We can also think about investing control or investing human energy for the purpose of increasing ecological integrity. That's what we recognize as restoration. And similarly, we can let a place go and it may change on its own through invasion of species or what have you. So these are, I tend to think of that two-dimensional space as informing how we think about management in these systems. Well, this is the way that I thought about systems for quite a while. And in fact, Jerry and I have a chapter in the textbook Wilderness Ecosystems where we talked about restoration in wilderness in terms of these ideas of engaging in restoration and driving a system down toward the lower right-hand corner with the expectation that at some point it would be released and turn and recover on its own. Well, I no longer believe that. I believe that the advent of climate change and other forces of global change have eliminated this, have made it unrealistic to think that we can any longer just let a place go and expect that it will return to some sort of historical, pristine condition. The world is different. Climate change, invasive species, land use change, atmospheric deposition, these forces are all driving systems away from historical conditions. There are still going to be places where we can let a place go and rest it and it will regain some semblance of natural conditions. But as a long-term strategy, I no longer believe that we should expect the system to hold its natural condition in the face of all these drivers. So, what does that leave us with? It leaves us with only three options for the future. We can let a place go and expect that it will change and accept that change. We can fight against that change and continue to invest energy in a place in order to try to maintain its ecological integrity, or we can engage in a process of changing, of intentional change, trying to move the system into a condition that's different from the past of our choosing. Hopefully with the intent, with the expectation that it becomes more resistant to these drivers of change through our action. So that's what we're left with, these three different options for management in the future, I believe. Now, what is the right choice? What should we be doing in order to try to sustain these things that we care about from wildland ecosystems? What should we be doing to try to pass on to the future the building blocks of future ecosystems, even if they're changed, which I think is one of our big responsibilities here? I don't really know. I don't know what the right option is. I tend to agree with Connie Millar and her colleagues who assert that the future is uncertain, it's certain that the future will change, but it's uncertain how. And we have to prepare ourselves, we have to manage accordingly. And to me, that leads to the conclusion that we're going to have to try all three of these different strategies. We don't know what the right one is. And so we're going to have to try them all. That leads me to this notion of a portfolio of approaches to climate change adaptation. And this is where the resilience comes in. We're going to have to hedge our bets and spread the risk among a portfolio of strategies, employing all three of those different strategies. So that leads me to this idea that we ought to be setting up through planning, through planning processes, especially on the public lands, but really involving the entire landscape, this portfolio of different strategies employing observation only in some places, a strategy of restoration or engaging in keeping all the parts, even if it's swimming upstream against the tide of climate change, and in other places engaging in innovative management and intentionally changing. Each of these, I believe, has strong arguments in favor of it. You know, the observation-only wilderness-style management has an excellent track record of conservation over the years, though there's a good, strong argument to be made that it's not sustainable in the long run. But I believe we'd be foolish to throw it out. Restoration, something we've been engaged in for a couple of decades now. I think a lot of us strongly believe that historical dynamics is the only model we have of a system that has sustained biodiversity over time, and that it's our duty as managers to try to sustain those dynamics and sustain those systems into the future. To me, that's the essence of conservation, is trying to pass forward into the future that which we've received from the past. But as others have pointed out, it's based on a time when the climate was different than we expect it to be in the future, and there's reason to believe that it is also unsustainable. That leaves us with innovation, but which makes a lot of sense in these kind of theoretical arguments, but is a pretty scary proposition, and one that forces us to contemplate all that we don't know about ecosystems. But I think we're going to have to try it. So we just don't want to try it everywhere. So we're going to have to try all three of these approaches in an integrated landscape experiment, learn lessons as we apply it, and adapt our behavior as we learn. How should these different strategies be applied? I think that it's really very important, and the Wilderness Society believes that it's very important, that these three different strategies not simply be applied willy-nilly across the landscape in scattershot fashion, where there's great potential of them working at cross purposes and confusing and frustrating our ability to learn from the application of different adaptation options applied to the landscape. Instead, we need to apply them to well-understood zones across the landscape, so that we're applying things like, assisted migration and creation of novel ecosystems in one part of the landscape while we're applying more conservative approaches like protection of climate refugia and elimination of known stressors in others, so that we're not canceling out the effects of different adaptation options in different places. So that leaves us with this concept of zoning the landscape for this giant landscape experiment. And so what rules do you apply to this zoning exercise? Well, I think we can go back to kind of well-worn, well-understood concepts of conservation biology for much of that guidance. We want each of these zones to represent the range of conditions found across landscapes. We want these zones to be well connected across relevant climate, especially climate-relevant environmental gradients, so that species can move around in response to stimuli and still stay within their zones. And we want them configured in such a way that we minimize edge effects and the potential for confounding, canceling effects as well. So we're talking about large, well-connected zones on the landscape. Just to give you a picture, just a mental picture of what I'm talking about here, this is an illustration from the Sierra Nevada, where we just took places where there was a chunk of wilderness at high elevation, there was a chunk of non-wilderness national park somewhere else on the landscape, and up here a high elevation chunk of general national forest land that hadn't been allocated to any other particular land use. And we showed how a wilderness landscape could be connected across the environmental gradient of the elevation gradient of the Sierra Nevada, just by connecting watersheds from the highest to the lowest elevations, and then capturing the watersheds adjacent, so that we had water courses and adjacent uplands protected from the highest elevation to the lowest elevation within this kind of observation-only zone in which wilderness-style management prevailed. Another one where we thought that it made sense that that non-wilderness national parks, wildlife refuges, monuments, things that were allocated to the purpose of maintaining certain values, often described in legislation, maintaining those values over time, was a good place to engage in restoration, the active assertion of human energy to preserve into the future what we inherited from the past. And then the sort of general non-wilderness, non-park national forest land was a better place to engage in more innovative styles of management. That's just a kind of illustration. I wanted to also suggest to you that this is not this idea of zoning the land across relevant environmental gradients is not new. This is an illustration from, this is the island of Lanai in Hawaii. The ancient Hawaiians had a system of land allocation where they carved up the land and gave to various families strips of land that ran from the coast all the way to the top of the mountain. They called them Ahupua'a. And it's this ancient system of land use that's really driven by the same notion that every family ought to have access to a plot of land that provides them all of the resources, the full range of resources available to them as it would be available to other species, and but then allows each of the families to make determinations as to how and for what they would manage those land systems. So it's not that radical an idea. Emma Maris, who has recently produced a very interesting book called Rambunctious Garden, where she makes the case that we kind of need to embrace these more radical notions of land use, abandon our slavish adherence to the past, and embrace things like invasive species in certain places. she envisions this notion of carving up the land in different chunks and managing for different definitions of nature in different places. And she actually closes her book with reference to this Ahupua'a system. So just to close, I want to show you that we've actually been making an effort at the Wilderness Society to try to figure out how one might make such an allocation in a real landscape. We've been engaged in the planning process for the Sierra Nevada National Forest, which has been going on for a while now. And I've been working with a spatial analyst in our San Francisco office who has developed a system that allows us to take information about the ownership or the land classification of various classes of land, whether it's wilderness or an experimental forest or a research natural area or you name it. If it's got a name and a management style applied to it, we went through and tried to figure out which of the 3 zones it would be most suitable for and weighted it accordingly using a weighting system that we developed internally among the ecologists at the Wilderness Society. We also intended to, though have not developed it sufficiently, a module to this model that takes information about the ecological condition of the land, the degree to which it's been affected by fire exclusion, that kind of thing, to try to inform which zone it's most appropriately managed as, and then to take some rules of contiguity, connectivity, shape smoothing to try to create these zones based on what the algorithm suggests it would be most suitable for and how the landscape is configured. And we have we've gotten so far as to be able to utilize the information about the existing land allocation, blind for the moment to ecological condition, to assess the relative suitability. This is, as you might see, it's the entire Sierra Nevada from the Oregon border down to the Tehachapis. And the algorithm has been able to assign suitabilities to watersheds for each of these 3 strategies. And then we've been able to look at each watershed and figure out what the algorithm suggests it's most suitable for and create this first cut crude map just to show that information about the land. This is the reason I'm showing this, not because of what it tells you about the Sierra Nevada, but really just to illustrate that it is possible to take information about the land and inform these decisions about zoning to these different strategies. We still need to build in the ecological integrity information. Unfortunately, we have run into some budget cuts that severely hamper our ability to make progress on this, but the overall approach still needs ecological integrity information brought to it. It needs to have this configuration analysis developed. It needs to be brought down to a scale that's relevant to planners. You know, nobody's going to be making huge assignments of the entire Sierra Nevada, but the forest planning process will take national forests and make allocations. That's the essence of forest planning. And then finally, as I mentioned, it's driven by a weighting system where people make decisions about what they think is what these land classes and levels of integrity are most suitable for. We have taken a stab at that internally, but we really need to open that up to a much broader range of stakeholders to help the machine determine what the appropriate weighting system should be. But we think that once we have done this, we'll have a decision support system that should be helpful to the Forest Service in making these allocations. And the Forest Service can start thinking about management within these zones. It's not our intent that these be rigid fixed designations like a wilderness area. Rather, it's our intent that it be kind of a philosophical overlay over the landscape that can help guide managers when they're thinking about climate change adaptation options. Is this the right kind of adaptation option to apply within this zone? It's got to still be reflective of the realities of the landscape and the existence of human values, infrastructure, et cetera. But we think it's a promising approach. So that's I believe that's the end of my talk, and I'm happy to entertain questions from here. Nope. Anybody? Yes?
At first, when you cut off that top right hand edge of your illustration there, I kind of thought you were stepping away from standard Wilderness Society approaches, but then you folded it back in with the observation only.
Yeah, I still believe strongly that we need places that we simply observe. And wilderness has served that role well over the years and has, as I mentioned, a great track record for conservation. And I still believe what has changed is my expectation that letting a place go will preserve it intact forever. You know, climate change is not a threat to untrammeled character, as long as you're willing to accept that it will change. What it is a threat to is our ability to sustain into the future the systems that were developed under a different climate of the past.
Yes, the Wilderness Society agrees with that point of view?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Wilderness Society accepts that it's very important to maintain untrammeled character. I think what is changing is that we have kind of been our own worst enemies in selling the idea that if we keep our hands off, we will be able to preserve a place intact forever. That's what's different.
That's a big change.
Yeah, and it's you know, we're learning as we go. So, yeah.
It seems like you put restoration in this box that makes me a little uncomfortable, so I just wanted to mention it, and then
Okay.
maybe you can comment on it. But it seems like in your view of restoration, it's restoring things to past conditions, and then this novel conservation thing is just something else. And I feel like a lot of restoration ecologists today are accepting of the fact that things are going to change and that we can't always aim for historic conditions, but instead we can take that into consideration and manage for resilience and recognize that things are going to change just through species migration and that kind of thing. So I guess maybe just a comment on that.
Yeah, I believe that restoration is inherently historical. So if you're not working with reference to the past, then you're not engaged in restoration, you're engaged in something else. You're engaged in this transformation idea. Somewhere along there, but there's this spectrum of whether you're trying to drive a system into some rigid historical description that you've derived from research versus whether you're simply using ecological knowledge that you have developed about the system based on study of past conditions, which is all we can study, right, is what our observations are of things that have happened in the past. So we might say, well, we think we're going to have more fire in the system in the future under a different climate, and we know something about the way that these systems behaved with respect to fire in the past, so we're going to apply our knowledge of fire ecology to developing novel systems in the future, like we're going to convert a mixed conifer forest to a pure ponderosa pine forest that we think will be more resilient to fire in the future. To me, that's I would assign that kind of an example to this innovation idea, where you're actually making changes to the system based on an understanding of the past. But I would not call it restoration unless you're really trying to sustain the composition and dynamics of that system into the future. Yeah.
I'm curious to get back to the idea of wilderness areas as being areas that are delineated just as observation approach. Do you think that may put them at a higher risk for entrance to the portfolio approach? Do you think it would ever be appropriate to suggest a portfolio approach within wilderness areas?
It has been suggested, actually. David Cole at the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute has been advocating for a few years now this sort of idea of assigning different wilderness society or wilderness areas to different definitions of natural. And personally, I think that's too narrow a view, that we need to look at wilderness as a component of a larger landscape and start thinking about the larger landscape in those terms. That said, I think we live in a world where our wilderness areas are not always in the best ecological condition, and in some cases may pose a threat to people and systems outside in terms of their conditions. For instance, there's a move afoot to designate a portion of the Santa Fe watershed near Santa Fe, New Mexico as wilderness. Well, this is a system that's well recognized to have been highly altered in the past and now poses considerable fire risk to the city's watershed. And it may be a case where one would want to engage in some restoration activity in advance, try to increase the probability of that system surviving the next fire, or try to get it into a condition that's more likely to be able to sustain itself, or at least to get it into a condition where it poses less of a threat to the local community before designating it, and then allowing it to change with restored fire in the future. So. I guess the way all I'm saying is that I think we have to have a realistic view of wilderness and wilderness management. It'd be nice to just say wilderness or the observation zone is the place that we're just going to let go and never intervene. I think that's ideal but unrealistic. We're going to have to consider other options. Yeah? No. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say because a lot of wilderness is they call it the rock and ice.
Right. So, yeah. I apologize, but no, we have not yet been able to bring really any ecological information into the analysis. We're sort of a third of the way through it, really. Other people have done that analysis, and you're absolutely right. There's, heavy over-representation of certain ecosystems, often called rocks and ice, and drastic under-representations of others. So if we're going to move to this kind of, to the allocation of lands to observation, it can't rely simply on existing wilderness. We're going to have to think about a much broader swath of the landscape. So, yeah, that's... Yeah.
What do you think the chances are that the different national forests that make up the Sierra Nevada will readily adopt your recommendations for the different categories? I'm not really familiar with their current land uses. Is there a big timber program on ORDs, on livestock grazing, where they have the flexibility to embrace the majority of your suggestions for the different
Yeah, I think it's a novel concept, and it's going to take, it's a big leap. And so I don't expect, we're really just kind of trying to float the idea out there and get it, make it part of the discussion of forest planning. But I will say, because all the things that you mentioned are out there, there are all these competing uses. But I believe that this 3-zone portfolio really can accommodate all of those uses in different ways. In some places, it's going to be a more aggressive implementation, and others we're going to have to back off. But just as an example of the kind of promise, some of the scientists are actually talking with the regional forest, or the staff of the regional office, about allocating some large chunks of the Sierra National Forest to an experimental landscape allocation where they would really try to bring fire back on a large scale through an experimental approach. And it's going to be much bigger than any existing experimental forest or research natural area or probably any zone that they've ever drawn a line around on one of their planning maps before. And I don't know that they'll get there, but it's a very real subject of discussion in the planning process now. Yeah?
Along with that, I'm just curious if you think that bringing fire into the untrammeled wilderness area should be consistent with the observation strategy.
Yeah, how that gets done is a big question. We have fought fire in wilderness for a long time, but we also fight fire outside of wilderness that could and should burn into wilderness. And the challenge of getting fire back into those systems so that we can just observe them without the observed changes being a direct result of our past fire management is a big challenge. So, it's going to be a transition. It's not easy. But I think we have to start thinking about our actions intentionally. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
All right.